Lannin and I direct the campus writing program, and our program really looks at how we support the teaching with writing across campus. So we're looking at writing in all of the disciplines. Our students take writing intensive courses, and we provide the support and the review of those courses. So during these years of working with faculty and students, and again, thinking about how we learn through writing, we were able to work with Mary Browning, and she has been just such a good advocate for students. And in 2019, before we hit a pandemic, we were able to join also for a celebration of student writing. And she brought a pretty large number of international students that she was working with at that time, and they shared their writing. We ended up publishing some of their writing, and that link is what you have a link to in chat. And so you can see some of the work that she's done with working with students at Mizzou. She's currently serving as director of the TRIO program for student support services at Columbia College. So again, that wonderful position of supporting students with their learning. And so Mary, though, graciously agreed to share with us some of the approaches she has taken with supporting students who are writing in English language, but that is one of many languages that they are working with. And so there's such a wealth of learning and language knowledge that our students bring and that Mary is going to help us think about. So Mary, welcome, and we look forward to this time together.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be able to share this information because I've been working with international students and non-native speakers for many, many, many years. So it's always fun to collaborate with the campus writing program and all of you around campus who are interested in multilingual writers. And so what we're going to do is you can see that from the first slide, I just have a breakdown because I would like for this to be both presenting information, having some opportunities for discussion, and then taking a look at two versions of one piece of writing, which is a short piece of writing, and scoring it together so that we can talk about some of the things to look for with multilingual writers and how to support them. And then at the very end, I have a couple of rubrics and a few questions for contemplation because different countries and regions have different ways of looking at how it's appropriate to support writers and how much of that the writers have to do on their own. So I thought that would be kind of interesting. So the second slide is just showing you that we're going to take a look at Chinese and English and take a look first at grammar and sentence structure, and then take a look at organization and development of ideas, because not only is the grammar quite different between English and Chinese, but the thinking as well can be. And the information I've included in these slides comes directly from the students themselves who are in my program. So if we take a look at the next slide, this one is showing that their grammar is a real challenge because in Chinese, there just isn't that much grammar, not in the way that we tend to think about grammar. And one example of that is plurals. So you can see from the slide that people and person are the same ideograph. And this whole idea of count and non-count in English shows how challenging writing can be because you have words like information and research that are singular. And then students, which is plural, and time, which could be either. If you take a look at verb tenses, Chinese doesn't change tenses or forms in the way that English does. And you can just use an adverb. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a slide. I'm sorry. Chinese doesn't have articles. So the words and the and no article at all can be very challenging. And there are actually 50 rules about how we use articles in English. And the is the most common word in English. And comes in at number 4. So you can imagine if they don't exist, not only in Chinese, but many languages, that it's a real challenge in English. Prepositions, little words like in, on, and at, again, very challenging. And then moving on to the next slide, I was mentioning verb tenses, and I think this example does a really good job of showing that you can express the same idea correctly, but it will look very different in terms of the grammar. So English is loaded with indicators like had been waiting, when it began to rain, and contrasting those two tenses. And if you look down at the Chinese, when sky begin rain, I already wait 20-minute bus. So thinking about some of the grammar points that we looked at, there would be quote unquote errors if somebody were directly translating from Chinese to English without accommodating the grammar. There would be errors in verb tenses, prepositions, plurals, articles. And yet you can express that exact same idea in Chinese and perhaps just add the word yesterday or last week and still have very clear meaning. The final point on grammar, I think this is interesting because it comes down to the reader or the listener's responsibility. And in writing in English, we do what many other cultures would feel is quite a bit of repetition, and some would even say unnecessary repetition of who or what we're referring to. Whereas in some languages, including Chinese, you can use pronouns more frequently. He instead of referring to a person's name or the president or the manager or whatever, or she referring to the person's name as opposed to the director. And it's just that idea of responsibility, I think, is just something that comes up in writing and can be an interesting comparison. And then the second part of this is that also organizing and developing ideas can be different. One of the students here was explaining that when Chinese students write, the mode of thinking differs from English. So you'll have a lot of stories, maybe adjectives, idioms, metaphors, and quotes from poems, famous people or literary classics. The idea is enriching and strengthening the feelings. And they're talking about how the essay may not be direct or obvious in stating the central idea or the main point. And that is really important when writing in English. If the idea is not directly stated in a lot of the academic writing that we do, then we feel like something is lacking or it's not accurate. And so this person is explaining that when she has to write, she has to use a lot of examples, facts, statistics, and research, as opposed to some of the more imagery related types of ideas. And the next slide goes into this in a bit more detail, and also I think includes an interesting quote from President Xi talking about comparing mountains not stopping the flow of the river into the sea and meandering as a way of comparing United States and Chinese relationships. And in this imagery, apparently it's used very frequently. It's common in everyday informal Chinese writing and speaking, and especially when you're describing a complex thought. So when we're doing academic writing, frequently a multilingual writer from a different cultural background may be tempted to approach the writing in a way that would show the complexity, whereas that may not be direct enough and clear enough when writing in English. And the last slide in the first part has to do with crediting sources and plagiarism. And it was interesting to see how Bohan had explained that in Chinese, at times in Chinese schools, it's okay to repeat the ideas of some famous writers to show the knowledge. And because the professors are familiar with these sources, it's not always considered plagiarism if the author is not identified. And when students are young, they're frequently told to imitate the style and ideas of strong Chinese writers as models of good writing. And we find that with many of our international students, this whole concept of plagiarism can be one that is difficult to really grasp because of some of these complexities and what's considered okay and what isn't. So I've also included, for those who are interested, a YouTube documentary, which is extremely well done. It's in 3 parts. It's free, available on YouTube, and those are the links. It's called Writing Across Borders. And that particular documentary gives a really nice overview of some of the issues faced by multilingual writers in an academic setting. And then I also included a handout that I received one time at a conference on differences between Arabic and English, just for your own interest. So that was just kind of an overview, because sometimes we have the feeling, why is someone making errors when they're writing in English? Shouldn't they have better control or command of the language at this point? But the things that we've been talking about, the plurals, count, non-count words, prepositions, articles, those can take a lifetime to master, and they usually do not interfere with someone understanding the meaning of the writing. And so as either faculty or writers ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, at what point do we expect complete accuracy or perfection for the paper to be deemed as being good or even excellent? And so we'll be talking about that a little bit more when we actually evaluate one of the papers. Now, one of the things that I found was the most helpful, and we'll have a little bit of discussion after this, are strategies for supporting writers. And this is something that many of you may already do, but we don't always do it regularly and consistently as instructors, and we don't always remember to keep doing it during the term. And that's just regularly and anonymously modeling samples of strong current student writing. Many students don't realize how strong their own writing is, and they have this feeling that other people are writing better than they are. And students in general frequently really appreciate the feedback of examples of strong writing, and not just the example, but why. So perhaps sharing the introduction to a piece of writing, sharing some really specific examples within the body of a writing that are supporting a point, or really strong conclusion that is impactful and leaves the reader with a strong impression. And choosing to read excerpts aloud to the entire class and analyzing why it's strong as you do it, I have found is really one of the best, if not the best, way to really help students demystify the whole process of their expectations. And this also works with native speakers, because native speakers frequently are perhaps new to academia, especially in their freshman year, and don't always know how much depth or breadth to go into when doing a piece of writing. And by the instructor modeling samples and pointing out the strengths, it can really help to decode that process. I do it anonymously with the writer's permission. And the reason I do that is because many students don't like to have attention drawn to them, but I would never read a piece without their permission in case it is personal and something they don't want to share, or if they're just not interested in sharing for any reason. And then scoring ideas and content separately from control of language structures. So when a multilingual writer writes, there may be, very well may be, some of these unruly parts of the language of English that come into play, like errors in the things we've talked about: plurals, articles, prepositions, verb tenses. But by reading through those errors and looking for the ideas, it really keeps us focused on the message that the student is communicating. And by giving the student separate feedback on both the ideas and the content and the grammar separately, particularly for multilingual writers, helps them figure out what they need to work on. Because if the ideas in an essay are really strong and the student gets a D on the paper, and the D is mainly related to control of language, that student has no way of knowing if the piece either hasn't been scored separately, or if the student hasn't gotten feedback about where they were off track. The student doesn't realize that the ideas are strong and they just really need to focus on the control of grammar, or vice versa. If the control of grammar is really strong, but the ideas are not strong, So I personally, when I score a multilingual writer essay, and if I'm going to do it for multilingual writers, I would do it for everybody to be equitable. I'll give a score for ideas and content, and then a score for control of structures. And then I average it. And it's a holistic grading in the sense that I have rubrics at the very end that we can look at. And I can read those rubrics and get a sense of where the student realistically falls. And I find that's really helpful for orienting the student as to what to do to strengthen that paper.
So Mary, can I jump in with a question? Because I feel like one of the questions we have in chat fits in well with what you're talking about here.
Yeah.
So Ashley is asking about being a TA in a writing intensive course, and when there's grade norming, so when people are coming together to talk about how they're grading so there's consistency. And she's wanting to know, how can we manage this while still keeping multilingual students in mind? And it might be something we want to come back to at the end, but I just wonder if that fits in with kind of where you're at right now in the presentation.
Yeah, no, I wanted to stop right now and have some discussion. You know, it really kind of depends on the department and how much the department collaborates in making sure that you're all on the same page, because I imagine that in the intensive writing courses that you work together quite closely, whereas in some departments, each faculty member might be grading more separately. One of the things that we used to do when we were faculty working in the same, for example, intensive English program is we would just have norming days where we would score writing together and talk about what we gave and why. And is that something that you have done in the campus writing program?
It is, and that's what Ashley's even describing. And Ashley, feel free to jump in if you'd like, but so that they're doing those norming sessions, but again, they're looking at, all of the students. And so how do they make sure that for their multilingual writers, that they are keeping those, in mind, the things you're talking about here when they're doing norming sessions?
Yeah. You know, in the sessions I've done, we frequently were scoring papers anonymously. We didn't have the student's name tagged to the essay, so we didn't know who was a multilingual writer and who wasn't. That said, you can frequently recognize multilingual errors, and I think it comes down to the rubric. So when you look at the rubric and you read the description of the types of errors, if somebody has occasional errors in articles in plurals, but it's not taking away from the actual intent and impact of the writing, and it's pretty accurate otherwise, I don't know that I would penalize them at all for that kind of thing. And so I just think going back to the rubric and looking at the description of the rubric, but not having this idea of it having to be perfect, if you will, because I don't know, personally, I don't know that we should hold a multilingual writer to having a perfect paper in order to be able to score an A, for example. Because you can have a very strong paper that just has a few errors in these unruly areas of language. And have I answered the question?
I think so. And then Ashley, if you want to jump in and unmute, that would be fine too, if you want to follow up or put in chat.
Yeah, no, that kind of answers my question. I mentioned that we meet every Friday to kind of do those grade norming sessions, and our rubrics also are broken down into content as one part of the rubric, and then writing quality as another to kind of get at those feedback types. And the papers they're working on right now are even broken down into introduction, conclusion, body paragraphs to be even more specific to where they're lacking a little bit or where they're exceeding.
Yeah, yeah. And you'll start to recognize certain, and I have this in the rubric, there are certain categories that are just much more, I mean, literally they take a lifetime to master, like prepositions, and they're so arbitrary, why we say depend on instead of depend of, like they do in French. And so this idea of perfection within those areas, sometimes by just letting go of that and asking yourself the question, is the grammar interfering with my understanding of the ideas? And is the lack of control serious enough that the student really is not expressing ideas in a way that aren't distracting and that they really should just have better control? And so there's something between having such a lack of control that it doesn't fall within the range of acceptable and perfection. But too often, I think as faculty, we might expect perfection when in fact that it's really a sliding scale, if you will.
And Mary, on that point, I had a question too. So I'm thinking a lot about the articles, for example, because I noticed that with speakers of Arabic languages as well, right? That articles are a challenge when they're writing in English. And what I also know, as you mentioned, is that it makes it sound so very clunky for native speakers and native readers that sometimes I see faculty and graduate students and myself having a hard time sort of getting past that clunkiness to figuring out the ideas. It's almost like it takes more effort to make meaning. And that feels like maybe that should be a deduction in grades sometimes. And I wonder how you square this idea of, because I'm absolutely on board with everything you're saying, but of it taking just a little bit more effort on the reader's part. How do you work with faculty on that point?
You know, I think there are two ways to look at that. And one is that it does sometimes become distracting enough that it will affect the score. And we're going to be looking at a piece of writing in a minute that I think will help illustrate that point. And the second thing is, if you can read through it without a great deal of difficulty, I think that's a clue that maybe articles are not as important as they have to be. So for example, we say the Mississippi River, but we say Lake Michigan. So one of the article rules is that sometimes and usually we use the with rivers, but not with lakes. And yet when you look at the contribution that a multilingual writer is bringing to the table, when you've got errors in articles, usually you can read through them. Because in English, when we say it's the first time we mention something, and the second time we say the. Well, once we think about that way, then when we're reading through it, it's no longer confusing because when they mention it the first time, we know who they're talking about. And so articles and all of the grammar errors can result in point deductions, but it's really the extent of it and how much it keeps you from understanding.
That really makes good sense. And I like your idea of like, it may feel really challenging in the introduction, but by the time I read through that and I get to the first paragraph, I'm sort of understanding their language patterns and it becomes easier. So we may have that initial like, oh, something's wrong with this. And if we just kind of push through, that seems to be helpful. Thank you.
Exactly. And when you read through it, you're reading for ideas and you're trying not to focus on the grammar. But when you read it for control of structures, you are focusing on the grammar so that you can then score that separately. And Amy, I can't really see the chat the way I have this set up. So if I'm missing any questions, if you'll let me know.
Will do. We've got it covered now. So thank you.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, let's take a look then if you're ready. Are there any other questions before we go to scoring? And I think that maybe by scoring this, it will help. So let's take a look at the slide that says scoring hands-on application. And for this particular slide, what we're going to do is look at a piece of writing, and we're going to look at it twice. It's by the same student. And in the writing, he was asked to respond to Amy Tan's essay, Fish Cheeks. And you don't have to have read the essay to be able to get a good feeling for what he's saying in his response. But in Amy Tan's essay, she describes a time, an incident with her family at Christmas where she was ashamed of being Chinese and of her family, but she later gained significant insight into herself, her family, and her culture. And the student writer, Ganzhong, who was directed to choose one of the prompts, chose number 1. So write about a time when you were embarrassed by a member of your family. So for the first version of the writing, what we're going to do, and you have, I believe, the handouts in your email, and it should be labeled Response to Fish Cheeks 1 and Response to Fish Cheeks 2. So we're going to look at 1. The first one, you're going to score the ideas only, and then you're going to score the grammar and control of English structures only. So for now, let's just take a look and only look at Fish Cheeks response 1. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read it. And then if you look at the instructions on the same slide, let's just use 1 to 10, with 10 being 100%, 9 being 90%, which would be an A, 8 being 80% a B, 7, 70%, just a typical grading scale. What score best reflects the writer's ideas and content on this piece of writing? And a 7 would be passing. An 8 would be better than passing, and a 9 or a 10 would be outstanding or exceptional. So the 1 through 10 first score will reflect the ideas and content. Read through the errors. Do not focus on errors in the first reading. Just focus on the ideas and content. And then read it again. And this is the first one, thinking about control of grammar. And do the lapses in the control of grammar on the second reading prevent you from understanding the ideas. Are they distracting you when you're reading it? And your grade will reflect the grammar. So I'm going to stop talking and give you just a minute to read that first response. So have you had a chance to read that one? So let's take a minute, if you're ready, to talk about this one. So in this piece of writing, and I'm starting to lose myself with all my windows open. So let me go back and open that essay again, or that short writing.
I'm losing myself with trying to share the PowerPoint too, Mary. So sorry, it keeps flashing. I'm trying to find the Word document buried behind it. My
Yeah,
apologies.
no problem. Zoom is so interesting.
While you're getting your screens figured out, I do just want to say that this was a great example of, I thought, if I had started this by first looking for just all out, I'm just going to score this paper, I think I would have gotten so wrapped up in some of the control of language that, you know, oh my gosh, this sentence isn't making sense or that. And by just starting out by giving myself permission, or at least just saying, no, don't even pay attention to those, just look at the meaning. It was just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. The meaning is definitely clear. I know what this writer is saying. I can picture this situation. I found myself loving this essay. Then when I went back and thought, okay, but yeah, boy, there's a whole lot going on here that would need the more of the language grammar adjustments. So anyway,
No,
that's
I think that's an interesting observation, and that's why I picked this particular essay, because he's got a very strong message, and yet it's fraught with errors. And so let's talk about this a little bit. So can some of you share the score that you gave? And please do not feel embarrassed. Don't worry about whether or not your score matches with what anybody else says, because this is just a learning experience and we're talking it through. And we're going to have different ideas about how we think this should be scored anyway. So if someone would just share what you have, and we'll go from there.
I can share. I gave it an 8 or a 9 on the ideas and content, just because I did feel that it was very clear to the reader what was going on, and they even addressed the points that why they were embarrassed, and then how it actually changed them, which is kind of like the implications for future. So I feel like in that side of things, it was a very clear paper.
And what about for the grammar, the control of language?
I gave it a 7.
Okay. All right. Somebody else? Be brave.
We have 2 in chat. I'll read to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't know why I can't see my chat. I'm sorry.
Windows. It's all right. I gave it a 9 for ideas and a 7.5 for control of language. And Amy gave it a 9 to 10, somewhere in there for content, and a 7 for language.
Okay.
And I'll jump in. I was right in there too. I gave him a 9.5, Amy, because I couldn't decide between a 9 and a 10. My mama heart was like, oh. And then a 7 for language.
Okay. So let me ask you a question. So it is very strong in ideas. And I think anything between an 8.5, a 9, 9.5, even a 10 would be appropriate for ideas. But let's talk about the control of language, the control of English. If this is an undergraduate course at the 100 level, would you feel that this control of language was acceptable? And let's assume that you had a longer piece and it had this kind of errors.
would this be considered an early draft or a final draft?
This would be, well, let's just assume I don't grade early drafts.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're grading an early draft, that's a good question. So let's assume it's it's an early draft, but personally, I don't grade early drafts, and the reason I don't is because I want students to take risks, and then I want to give them feedback so that they can do a much better job in another draft. But let's say it's a first draft, and they're going to be able to do it again. And you may or may not combine your grades, but it's a first draft. How would you score it? And we're just looking at language now.
I think it's passable, which is why I gave it a 7, because you can still understand the messages, but it is a little bit distracting as you're reading. So they didn't fail on communication, but it's not quite up to the standard that we're hoping for moving forward.
Okay. Anybody else?
I agree with Ashley. That was well stated. Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot better about this as a first draft than I would as a final draft or an end of semester sort of final product.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I had to score this particular piece, I do find the errors distracting. I can read through them, but I find them distracting. And I would say that for a 100 level course, that most students should have a stronger control of English at this point. When I teach English classes, I really, really want my students to trust me and to show me the level of error. Because if they're not showing me their actual writing and the level of error, then I can't help them improve. And so this is a level of error that I would like for the student to be able to work on during the course. And let's assume for the sake of discussion, it's toward the beginning of the term. And frequently a short response would be towards the beginning of the term. I would give a piece like this, maybe an 8.5 in ideas, because I think the ideas are very strong, but it did require effort to read through the control of language. And I would give it like a 5.5 in control of language, because I would find that there was still much more that could be controlled, that in a 100 level would be important. This is why I don't grade first drafts. I don't want to give a non-passing score, and this would end up, if I did that, it would be a 6.5, which would be a high D. I don't like to demotivate students when they're doing their first draft. And so I would give them that feedback, and I might even give them a number, but the score wouldn't count for me. And then I would ask them to redo it. And when they redo it, they would have an opportunity, because when I teach English, I do mark the errors. Now, in your particular classes, you're not teaching English, you're teaching writing. I know that the students do not go to the help desk to have their papers edited, and they should not be doing that. But I would think the student could go to the help desk or the writing desk. And Amy and Christy, you can help me out with this. Do you have people at the writing desk who could point out some of the types of errors that the student would work on without editing the paper?
Right. And so, and we're talking about the Writing Center, correct? Over in the.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So the Writing Center where the tutors work, the tutors are trained first and foremost to look for the content, the idea.
Mhm.
How is the paper doing on those things? But they will point out patterns of error. So that way, if it's something they see going on throughout, they can offer those kinds of instructional pieces, so that, again, it's more like a coach, not an editor's role that they're playing.
Yeah, okay. And it's interesting because they've done research that shows you can either mark the type of error if you were to be teaching English, or you could just mark some of the errors. And just by drawing attention to it, students are often able to go back and fix it. Like this Chinese student, he knows that he needs plurals. He knows sometimes if he uses present and the time has passed. And so by just getting the message that the control of language is really not quite passing, and you could even give a score of 6, or a score, I probably wouldn't go higher than a 6.5, because I would want the student to work more on control of language, and then give a higher score for the ideas and content, because those are really very strong, very strong. And by reading through, you can see that. And then the student has a chance to go back and to think about those unruly errors of language that many students have had years and years of instruction in, and to go back and to take another look at it, knowing where to focus, knowing the ideas are strong and they don't need to go back and revamp. And it's really important for students to know not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that they've got a really solid paper in terms of content, but just to be able, in this case, to work on the grammar. And then vice versa. If you had a paper that had good control of grammar, but had very weak ideas, to be able to focus on that. So let's take a minute now and look at the next version of that paper, which is called Response to Fish Cheeks 2. And I'm going to give you a minute to read it and score it. It's the same paper, but a later draft of it, the same student. So let's take a minute and talk about this one. So what do you think about this one?
It's much better. The language has definitely improved a ton. Very. I think I give them like a 9.5 for controlled language. I still noticed a few errors here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Get even more clear, but for me, I was pretty impressed with the fixing that they had done.
Anybody else?
I really liked how this draft not only had fewer errors, but it had more interesting syntax too. There were some dashes in there. There were some nice transitions. So I thought that that was what made it seem so remarkably improved.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. So when you read draft number 2, are you comparing it to draft number 1, or are you reading it like as a new version and grading it on 1 to 10 based off of it's by itself, or how they've improved from draft 1?
That's a good question. And I personally, and I want to hear from other people, but I personally read it as a standalone. And so I would just be looking at it for the value that it has for this one and not comparing it with the degree of improvement. How about the rest of you?
Yeah, I think that is so dependent also on the assignment, because certainly sometimes I'll give students feedback, and then when I'm looking at their next draft, I'm wanting to see what have they incorporated and what have they chosen not to, because, you know, I also want my writers to know that, you know, if I make a suggestion on something, they may not go with that suggestion, which I think could be an interesting conversation. But again, it's so dependent on the writer and the type of feedback and the assignment itself, that, you know, what it is they're writing.
Yeah, I think there's an important point in there too. I always tell my students, you know, it's your paper and I'm giving you suggestions, and these are good suggestions, but if you have a reason not to incorporate my suggestions, that's okay, because it's your paper and you get to make the final decisions. So I think what's interesting about this exercise is that the ideas are pretty equally strong, but in the first one, the ideas might be graded a little bit less because it was sometimes more challenging to navigate through the paper, but that there wouldn't be a big difference in how you would score the ideas. But there should be a significant difference in how you would score the language. So to me, this is an A paper in both ideas and content and control of language. I think it's also important to realize that this paper could have occasional errors in articles, or maybe a verb tense error or two. It's a short paper, so not a lot of those kinds of errors. Maybe an error in plurals, maybe a preposition error or two, and it would still be an A paper. Because again, those are the aspects of language that can be very challenging. And you would be able to read through those minor kinds of errors if there aren't so many of them, and if they are minor. You get into more major errors when you have problems with word order and syntax in ways that really become quite distracting and require. You have to ask yourself at some point, how much effort as a reader are you having to put into understanding the ideas? But that it doesn't have to be perfection either, that students will have errors in their writing if they're multilingual writers. And I say they will, many students will.
We all will.
So if you look at number 15, so questions to ask, or I'd say 15 for Christy's sake, questions to ask yourself when reflecting on the importance of accuracy. Within your profession or your course, how important is English language accuracy? Any major concerns caused by potential miscommunications? So I think that's something to consider. There can be a higher, like for example, the journalism school has a much higher English language requirement for all applicants, whether they're multilingual speakers or not, because of the requirements of journalism. And that's also true in fields such as medical fields, where a certain degree of accuracy, of course, is expected in pharmacy, and pharmacy has a very high level of English competency required. And then what value, knowledge, skills, qualities, and diverse background could the student, prospective future worker bring to your profession? I sometimes hear faculty say that the student has so many errors in their writing, they're not even going to bother reading it. And I find that quite disturbing because frequently they're minor errors and they're not really detracting from the meaning when you get in the habit of reading through for fluency. And once you start reading through for fluency, you'll be able to recognize when the errors are minor, when they become more egregious, where you really are struggling to figure out what the writer is trying to say. And that plays into how you grade. And then is seeking help in writing, such as hiring an editor or getting help from a friend, only to correct the more unruly aspects of English grammar, is it ethical? Is it advisable? And have you ever experienced a different focus on individual effort, which is really very strongly emphasized in American studies, in writing in academic or workplace settings, perhaps while taking or teaching a non-traditional course or studying or working in a different country? So I'd like to take a minute and reflect on some of these points. So what do you think about some of those questions?
I can speak to at least one of them. I've been writing a paper with a non-native English speaker, and it's funny because we're submitting to a journal that's an international journal, and we keep getting dinged for language issues, which just seems so frustrating. And I feel like I'm a fairly decent editor, and I'm still not catching all of the things that they're dinging us on. So it's we're on round 3 of revisions.
Oh yeah.
Journal, and so I feel like I've kind of gotten a little bit of a window into like, your ideas are great, but you need to fix some language issues. So that's just something that's kind of been feeding into how I work with my students and looking at helping them, because their solution was just hire a professional editor to fix it. And I'm like, I don't want to hire a professional editor to fix my science education writing. Like, so yeah.
So is it accepted within your field to help somebody correct those? Because you're not changing the ideas. That's the really important thing, because when we start changing ideas, that's plagiarism. But if you're just fixing the little grammar points, is that acceptable within your profession?
As far as I know, it's not unusual to have someone to read through your paper and help fix grammar, or point out unclear information. I call on Christy all the time to help with that, or like citation formatting. Like, yeah. So yeah, as far as I know, it's okay in science writing and science ed. But I'd love to hear other people's feedback on that.
Yeah.
You know, on the other side of that, I really think that's an interesting question, because one of my own feelings of inferiority is that I'm a good writer because I was an English teacher. Like, I like to read, writing is my thing. But I often wonder if my manuscripts make it in more easily because they're quite easy to read, but maybe their ideas aren't nearly as rigorous as I know Julie's co-author, and he has really rigorous, interesting, wonderful ideas. And so it's interesting to me how I may reach out to Julie and say, here's a thing I have written. Can you help me think about what questions you have, or how can I deepen it? Which is really talking about ideas, you know? I just think it's interesting that it could be either side of that equation. It's made me reflect on my own writing.
That's a good point, because you're collaborating on ideas. Can you then collaborate on the accuracy of the English? And Christy, why don't we stop sharing the screen so that I can see everybody, because we're just going to have a chat for now. Thank you.
And Mary,
how about the rest of you?
Yeah, we do have some interesting questions popping up in chat as well.
Oh, okay. Now I can see the chat. Whew. Okay. So somebody's asking about the feedback that I give on the first draft. I think it depends on your content area. When you're teaching English as a second language, I give quite a bit of feedback in the sense of marking the type of error. So for example, if there's a verb tense error, I have a whole editing symbol sheet. I'll just put VT. for verb tense, and they know they need to look at it for that problem and fix it. I'm not going to fix it for them because then they're not learning. It's really, really important the student corrects their own errors. And I tell them in the beginning, one of my goals for the course is for them to become their own best self-editors. And if it's, for example, word form, like in English, we say, I, you, we, they ask, and he, she, it asks with an S. That's a huge issue for a lot of multilingual writers. So I'll just put VF, verb form, and they know to look for that. Or word form, if they say national, it should be nationality, that kind of thing. So I have students in an English language course really want that feedback, and I see marked improvement. I do more of that in the beginning, and then throughout the course, I pull back a little bit and I'll do maybe half of the paper, or I'll do towards the end, maybe a long paragraph. And sometimes if I start marking verb tense and I'm writing VT, 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 I just write down, check your verb tenses throughout. And then at that point, they're responsible for doing the whole thing. And it's amazing what people can find when they know what to look for. So if you're helping each other, if you're submitting something for publication, you don't really necessarily have to correct the errors for them. You can just say, whoa, check your verb tenses, and then let's look at it again. Or look for singular and plural. Singular plural can be a huge issue for many Asian languages. Let's see. You know, the reason I don't have students read their work out loud is because many of the students in an ESOL class have a very strong accent. And it can be very difficult for other students to understand them. And so I have just chosen to read everybody's paper, no matter how strong or how close to English their accent is. When I read it, though, I also project it, even when I read it, because it's really helpful for a multilingual writer to see something in written form. And I encourage you in your own classes to share things in a written format when you can, because it, when I say written, where they can actually see it on the overhead projector.
Do you encourage them, though, to read their own writing out loud to themselves at times, just to hear it as kind of part of their own writing and editing process?
And we do peer review, and I have them read it during a peer review, and their peers will have a copy of the paper in front of them while they're reading it. I think it's really important to be able to read out loud, because frequently that's when you catch things yourself. Yeah. That was another question. I was wondering about training students in the reality of publishing writing. This is something that I've really enjoyed working with the campus writing program on. A lot of multilingual writers think their writing isn't good enough to be published. And I've been so appreciative of Amy and Christy welcoming the students who were in the intensive English program and providing opportunities for them to publish. And I encourage all of my students to look for opportunities to publish, because man, does it ever raise their confidence level when they have something that's actually published, even if it's an excerpt on the multilingual writers page that you have at MU. Can be so empowering. So I do look for publishing opportunities. There's a contest, an essay contest through the Mid-TESOL, which is Iowa, Missouri, surrounding states. And the IEP students at the University of Missouri won for like 3 years in a row. They won all the awards. And for a while it was because there wasn't a lot of competition, but then there was competition and they still won. And I say it was because they were still really good papers, but they had a better chance.
And I can see that, Danielle, to the other part of your question of just really helping students understand, really all of our students, all of us, that what publishers and reviewers are going to expect. What are they looking for in accuracy and in communicating our ideas. I think I've found that when I give students opportunities to publish, that's where, as you would know in journalism too, those of you involved there, that that's where writing to communicate is just so important, because it makes it very clear that you have an audience and you have a purpose, you have a context you're working in, and how are you addressing all the needs of the situation. So anyway, I don't know, Danielle, if you want to add more to that question or other responses.
No, I think you guys approached it in a couple different ways, so I think that was helpful. Thank you.
Something I was going to say. Any other questions while I'm trying to think of what I wanted to say? I'll think of it in just a second.
Well, I'm thinking of the questions you posed to us. I'm still thinking of that ethical question about hiring editors, because I mean, early on in my teaching, I remember one of the best writers I've ever worked with, but boy, he couldn't spell at all. I mean, it was just, and, you know, and I remember having conversations, and even since then he's published and, you know, but he knew he at some point was going to need to hire somebody to just help him with some of that stuff. Now, probably computers and the technology available helps with that. But I think that's an interesting question, especially when we're thinking about in our classes and students are paying to be in classes and they're doing this writing. And what is that expectation of, well, there is a list of editors for hire that you can go find for your work. So would you talk about that, Mary, a little bit?
You know, I lived in Canada and I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees in Quebec. And in Quebec, there are two official languages, English and French. And everything has to be published in both languages, which means that university students have the right to either publish, do all their university coursework in English or French. And if you happen to not be bilingual, it's your responsibility as an instructor to figure out a way to be able to evaluate that student's work. So of course you are then having to rely on the other language speaker, English or French, to help you. And it was understood that those people who were more unilingual could perhaps speak English or French, but not at the point where you really feel like your paper is not fraught with errors that you wouldn't want to have in there. We would help each other, and that was never questioned. People just assumed that it was fine to get help from your friends as long as you weren't plagiarizing ideas. And I remember in my master's work, there was a young woman, Francoise, and there was a big concern about the quality of her paper because people felt that it was too strong to be a master's paper. It was that strong. And so they started wondering if her boyfriend had actually written the paper as opposed to just helping her with the errors. And everybody perfectly accepted that he would have corrected all the errors. That was never a question. And I thought that was so interesting because when you come back to the States, it's really considered not okay by many instructors for an international student, a multilingual writer, to get help with the grammar, the errors. So sometimes it also has to do with your, you know, the fluidity of languages in the environment that you're in. And in the United States, we have an incredibly strong focus on individual effort.
Well, that leaves us with more to think about. And again, it's not that there's a one answer for all situations, but it is something I think it's good to just be aware of that and to have that conversation, I think, with students and with colleagues.
And I remember the one thing I wanted to say, I know it's time to finish, but these strategies work for both native and non-native speakers, all of these strategies, because you will have native speakers who have tons of run-ons and fragments within their paper. And as somebody who has a strong command of the language, it's also getting in the way and you're recognizing it and you could be distracted as you're reading the paper. And I've had classes of both native and non-native speakers in the same class where they were both doing the same types of writing assignments, and we designed it so that it was about 50-50. And the feedback was the same, whether they were native or non-native speakers. Now, we did have pull-out workshops on certain grammar points, but other than that. So just something to keep in mind. And thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you, Mary. I always love hearing you talk about your teaching and your work with students. So we appreciate this so much.